We've arrived at a moment for a Devar Torah, and I want to offer some thoughts and words of where we are in this time. The word paradox has been my constant companion these last months. I understand paradox based on the teachings of Sarah Yehudit Schneider as the place of truth that lives inside things which might seem on the surface to be contrary. This has been a time of stillness and gratitude for our health and livelihood, while also mourning events canceled and trips postponed. It has been a time of reconnecting to nature during our regular walks through Frick Park, and at the same time, the loss of connection when we can't hug those dearest to us. On one hand, I have missed our monthly Kabbalat Shabbat gatherings, and I have delighted each Friday to light candles with some of you. Kids who need social interaction to feel complete have been relegated to learning from kitchen tables, while those who struggle with the demands of being in school or being social have found respite learning at home during this time. To say that times are complex is an understatement, and I believe we won't know the true impacts of this for years to come. For my part, much of what has given me life and livelihood has been canceled or postponed. Two of my greatest joys, learning with Kesher kids in our home and practicing earth-based embodied Judaism with Hebrew priestesses, have, for obvious reasons, changed shape entirely. At first, I feared that all that connected me to myself, to you, and to the divine might fall away in this seeming summer hibernation. And yet, over weeks and months, somehow, my sense of connection has grown stronger. I don't remember an Elul more packed with opportunities for self-reflection and learning than this one. Paradoxically, I've hardly left the house in months, and yet thanks to the magic of Zoom, I've been able to learn and light candles and collaborate with people across time zones. This has been a strange time, no doubt, and I know you must feel it too as we gather in this way. And yet part of me is awakened by this innovation of making community without geography as a factor, to gather folks of like mind and like heart, not because we're neighbors, but because we're kindred. For me, this is one of the most beautiful byproducts of this great reset. The world has in many ways slowed down to give us a chance to take stock and recalibrate. Arundhati Roy was right when she wrote about this pandemic as a portal, inviting us to consider what are we taking with us should we be granted passage through to the other side. Big moments like this, when systems halt and folks gather together to make a sense of the fallout, are rare in history. Rabbi B'nai Lappi, the leader of Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva, calls this kind of seismic change institutional crash. When she teaches, she generally refers to institutional crash in relationship to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem within roughly 2,000 years ago. She goes on to explain that when fundamental shifts like this happen, people exercise one of three options. Option one, hold tight to what you know, regardless of external circumstance. Conservative in purpose and by nature, these are the folks that we know today as Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. They are the ones who seek to preserve things exactly as they have been, prizing purity of tradition for its own sake. In the non-religious world, these are the folks who are clinging to the old world, life pre-pandemic, perhaps even ignoring evidence that the world around them is changing. Option two, opt out. These are the folks who, in the face of a rapidly changing landscape, fail to see any reason to persevere. These are the ones who walk away from Judaism altogether, perhaps moving to the far east, climbing up on the mountain, or simply letting the whole thing go. Though they might be doing what works best in the short run, in the long term, these people may find themselves untethered, feeling foreign among their own people, or wondering how they strayed so far from home. Luckily, there's also option 3. Carry forward the jewels of tradition while adapting and innovating to meet the moment. These are the people who believe, as Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan wrote, the past has a vote, but not a veto. We need to adapt to meet the new world. These are folks who ask the critical questions, not being satisfied to continue doing what we've always done when it doesn't work anymore. These are the folks who work toward greater inclusion, toward a Judaism and a world that is sustainable, desirable, and joyful. If we look at the institutional crash following the decimation of the Second Temple, we can imagine that people were in utter chaos. Their spiritual practices and life rhythms were centered around pilgrimages and offerings to the temple, and all of that ceased to be possible. In the wake of that destruction, a group of radical people got together and tried to make sense of the new world. They decided that rather than making offerings, they could replace this with verbal prayers. Liturgy was crafted. Times of day were determined for these prayer gatherings, and the rhythm of Jewish practice and the course of Jewish thought changed forever. These innovative, adaptable, radical people were, of course, the rabbis. They are responsible for the fact that what many of us practice today is rabbinic Judaism, defined by laws and guidance created in those times and evolving ever since to meet external circumstances. The rabbis of that time were option 3 people, bold in their choices because they didn't lose sight of their goal, and they were willing to adapt. As a social historian and Hebrew priestess, I'm always interested in how ancient practice has been transformed, and I love the ways that radical thought and innovation help us not only to survive, but to thrive. So it goes without saying that I was entirely taken by Rabbi Alan Liu's book, This is Real and You Are Totally Unprepared, The Days of Awe as a Journey of Transformation. This book, read by many Jewish spiritualists year on year, describes the spiritual journey of this season in great depth. Liu writes about the evolution of our liturgy and the meaning of this season, reminding us that in temple times, the way that atonement was made was through sacrifice and release, like the Azazel or scapegoat, for example. He explains that the rabbis who penned the Babylonian Talmud wrote the following: 3 books are open on Rosh Hashanah, 1 for the completely evil, 1 for the completely righteous, and 1 for everybody in between. The completely righteous are written and sealed in the book of life immediately. The completely evil are written and sealed in the book of death immediately. Those in between stand suspended from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, and if they merit it, they are written for life. If they do not merit it, they are written for death. According to this Talmudic account, 4 things will cause God to tear up the decree of judgment which has been issued against a person: acts of righteousness, fervent prayer, changing one's behavior, and changing one's name. I sometimes think that as a child, I was a Talmudist, believing that everything that I did in those 10 days might keep me alive in the coming year. Hence my eagerness to fast and my willingness to sit in that sanctuary, a tree of life, quietly and contentedly, as though trading those minutes and hours for the weeks and months ahead. And I suspect I wasn't the only one. It's no wonder that so many folks had taken option 2, walking away from this system of understanding that doesn't stand to reason. After all, how could it be that the impact of how we act all year can be wiped out in 10 days? It didn't make sense when I studied innocent victims of the Holocaust as a young person. It didn't make sense when my grandma, the most loving person I knew, died. It doesn't make sense now as countless people die of COVID and state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown people continues. I hope that we can agree that there is no correlation between righteousness and being alive. You can imagine my relief as I continued through Rabbi Lou's book, realizing that nobody had taught me the nuance of language that changed from Talmudic times to modern liturgy. The text as we read it today, known as the Unatane Tokef prayer, no longer uses the word ma'akirin to tear up the decree. Rather, it has been replaced by ma'avirin, to soften. I can feel the difference between tearing up and softening. The Unatane Tokef prayer of our times teaches that 3 things, tefillah, tzedakah, and teshuvah, have power in our lives, that it can soften. They can soften what is decreed. And Rabbi Lou teaches that these acts will not change what is going to happen to us in the year ahead, but they have the power to change us and how we relate to the things that will happen in the coming year. Tefillah, or prayer, this is about centering ourselves in gratitude, feeling wonder, feeling a connection to all that holds us when uncertainty rises and we feel helpless. To me, this is not about saying prayers by rote. It is about cultivating the practice of being a prayer, one who gives thanks, one who puts aside pride to plead for strength, who makes time to pray for healing, who acknowledges that we are but instruments through which the divine plays the glorious symphony called life. This is the internal practice which brings steadiness and equanimity to our days. Tzedakah. I was taught that this was about charity, but in actual fact, the word tzedakah is derived from the Hebrew tzedek, meaning justice. This is about being in right relationship with others. It can look like making a charitable contribution, sure, but it also means learning to be good allies and accomplices to marginalized communities. In my experience, our tzedakah practice is most powerful when we do the work of self-reflection and dismantling oppression along the way. And of course, teshuvah, often misunderstood as repenting, beating our chests. The word teshuvah actually means return, and it is the practice of returning to ourselves, finding alignment and balance. Yes, sometimes this will mean critical self-analysis and taking a hard look at where we've missed the mark, making amends, apologizing, offering forgiveness, but this isn't the totality of the practice. The purpose of teshuvah is to clear what stands between us and being in connection. It gives us clarity so that when we arrive at an intersection where we've previously taken a wrong turn, we don't continue on autopilot. We consult our internal GPS and choose another path. Thought about this way, it all makes perfect sense. If we are connected spiritually, in right relationship with others, and in full integrity with ourselves, we are in a much better position to receive whatever is coming our way in the new year. We don't have control over when hardship will knock at our door. And in many cases, we don't know what will precipitate our last breath. Those who have faced what we might call a harsh decree, illness, death of a loved one, the dissolution of relationship, financial ruin, we know that in the face of monumental occurrences, we have no control over the situation. but our relationships, our heldness, our sense of connectedness can help us to better meet all that comes our way. Friends, I don't think I have to tell you that there is much coming our way. And despite sometimes being criticized for it, I am grateful and proud to be an option 3 person, dedicated to carrying forward Jewish tradition while adapting to meet these times that we're living in. It has always been my deep desire to be in an option 3 community, one which neither ignores nor gives way to external circumstances, but rather finds its way through together. It's why I believe in putting relationship before task, or more accurately, why I believe that togetherness and joy is more important than completion of liturgy. It's why you'll sometimes find me at Civil Saturday praying with my feet on Shabbat as a sacred act. It's why I seek to center marginalized voices and experience as fundamental to the wholeness of our community. It's why I innovate ritual and ceremony to bring resonance and meaning. It's why I'm insistent that we move away from consumer culture and lean into being in covenantal relationship with one another. And most of all, it's why I'm willing to be a kink in this unbroken chain of all that has been handed down with its beauty and its trauma. We are in a historical moment now, not just because November 3rd is fast approaching. Existentially, many leaders in the Jewish world agree that we are now in a time of institutional crash. The Jewish structures which have held us for decades and centuries are waning. The face of leadership is changing. People who were not afforded a seat at the table when I was born are now here delivering a Devar Torah tonight. Those who choose option 1 risk becoming increasingly insular. Those who choose option 2 may eventually return to find that our community has changed shape in their absence and that we are now unrecognizable to one another. Meanwhile, we option 3 people, we're making Jewish history. Our modern day traditions were derived from circumstances from times past. And what we are doing in this quarantine, how we are gathering, how we welcome Shabbat, how we engage social activism, write new liturgy, learn new songs, live Jewish values, these things will come to be known in centuries and millennia ahead as traditions that were born in the time of the COVID plague. We may not be remembered by name, but I dare say that what we are evolving and creating in this time may have more impact on the Jewish future than anything that I've done yet in my lifetime. Each year on Rosh Hashanah, we read the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac and the subsequent covenant that was formed. We have reached that time again, and it's time for us to remember the power of a covenant, to recommit ourselves in connection, teshuvah, tzedakah, tefillah. It is a moment when we are invited to affirm our willingness to be bound to one another and to commit to making sacred community together for our own sake and for the sake of so many others, for our liberation is tied to the liberation of all. After all this talk about the importance of these 10 days of awe, I remember a teaching I once heard that said, it's not what we do between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that determines the trajectory of our lives. It's what we will do between Yom Kippur and next Rosh Hashanah that makes all the difference. May this 5781, all the time between Yom Kippur and next Rosh Hashanah, be a year of health and sweetness. May it be one of deep connectedness, of joyful justice, and of returning home to ourselves and to each other. Shana Tova and Shabbat Shalom.